All right, let's get started. Welcome to the Salem Center co-sponsored event with the Austin Institute. We're happy to have Carl Trueman here. Treat to have him here. He was here briefly a few months ago, I think, but today he's talking with us, and he's also giving a talk for First Thing tonight, right around the corner or something, somewhere. Some of you have probably registered for that. He's a professor of biblical and religious studies at Grove City College in Pennsylvania. Before that, he was at Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, which I believe my wife's grandfather attended. In 2020, he got real famous. He published his arguably, not even arguably, most popular book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And then Strange New World after that is a kind of a popular version of that. I had the happy occasion of being able to review that. Excellent book. Active contributor to First Things magazine, real man of letters, can span most conservative of Protestants to Catholics to how to think of outside Christianity in general. He's an ordained minister in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, as of course was my wife's grandfather. Educated in England and Scotland, he's on the Council of Alliance for Confessing Evangelicals, a fellow at the EPPC in Washington, D.C., Evangelicals in Civic Life program. Finally, he's a deeply decent man, and he actively participates in dialogue with Christians of all types who are concerned about the intellectual and cultural climates going on. The pathway to this place was paved, and sometimes with our own participation and acquiescence, this place of cultural and intellectual moment. And Carl is one of the best at kind of discerning that cultural and intellectual moment, and helping show not only where it came from, but how we also participate in it. So without further ado, please welcome Carl Trueman.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be with you all today. Mark made me sound like a really great guy. You could have gone on for a few more minutes there. And, you missed out my greatest claim to fame, the thing I'm most proud of. There's actually a novel with an alcoholic Catholic priest based upon me in it. Some years ago, an author emailed me. She was writing a historical novel on medieval Europe, and she'd listened to some lectures I'd given on the medieval church. And as a thank you for these lectures, wanted to make me a character in her novel. And she suggested making me a peasant farmer, which is what my ancestors would have been. I didn't want to be a peasant farmer. I've always been a fan of the Graham Greene novel, The Power and the Glory, which I consider, I think it was 25 when he wrote it or something, and I consider one of the great novels of the 20th century. So I emailed her back and I said, flattered to be in your book, but any chance you could make me a whiskey priest? So there is I won't tell you which it is, but there is a historical novel out there with a character called Carl in it, who is an alcoholic priest, and it's based on me, which connects me to one of the reasons I'm delighted to be in Austin, and that's I live in Pennsylvania, where liquor stores are state controlled, but I happen to love Garrison Brothers bourbon, almost impossible to get hold of in Pennsylvania. So I'm very grateful that the gentleman giving me a ride back from this talk today is going to detour by Total Wine so I can pick up a bottle. But I'm not an alcoholic priest. I merely resemble one in some ways. So I wanted to talk today. Mariana asked me to come and more or less said, talk anything you want, but try to make it practical at the end. I want to talk about, well, the burning question of the day, which is not the question I'm going to talk about, but perhaps the most highly charged political question of the day is, what is a woman? It's the name of a Matt Walsh documentary. It caused something of a storm in a recent Supreme Court Senate hearing. It's a very pressing question. Careers can be broken by giving the wrong answer to that question. But I've become increasingly convinced that as politically charged as that question is, it's less important than a less noticed but far more significant question, which really would shape how we think about everything. And that is, what is a human? It's not as politically charged a question, but I think it is a significant question. I'm currently working on a paper for the Heritage Foundation on transgenderism. And as I've been reading up to write this paper, I suddenly realized I'd missed something big in my book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. For those of you who've not read it, there's no reason why you should have done. It was an attempt to reflect upon how the statement, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body, has become so plausible. It was not a question of judging that question so much as why has that answer become so plausible? And it seems to me that while I was onto something in connecting transgenderism to the sexual revolution, one cannot separate it from the sexual revolution. Transgenderism also connects to transhumanism, another movement that is beginning to grip the popular imagination. And that, of course, points us towards the fact that the question, what is a woman, really comes down to what does it mean to be a human? And how we understand what it means to be human, I think, does shape precisely those things that Mariana wants me to touch upon today. Questions ultimately of family and workplace. So what I want to do is spend much of today's talk focusing on the question, what is a human? And then throw out some ideas at the end as to how that might shape how we think about family and how we think about the workplace. Question, what is a human, of course, is complicated by the fact that for most of us, what we are and who we are closely connected. Or we might say what we are tends to take a back seat to who we are. We're not simply our genes, nor are we simply our set of instincts. When I teach the kids at Grove in the final year humanities course, I talk about beavers. Beavers build dams. Human beings build dams too, but we do it in a different way. A beaver is hardwired to build a dam. Human beings choose to build dams or not build dams, and they choose to put those dams to a variety of purposes. For example, to reclaim land or to generate electricity, etc., etc. That's simply, putting it that way, simply a way of pointing to the fact that human beings are creatures of what I would call intention and not merely instinct. We do have some instincts, but we are above all creatures of intention. As I was leaving the house yesterday to head to the airport at 8 o'clock in the morning, I live in the wilds of Western Pennsylvania. It's hard to imagine a place more antithetical to the urban environment of Austin on the face of the planet. I live in the middle of nowhere, and so I was driving out of my drive. The local fox that I've come to know and love. We've never spoken, I've never got close to him, but I often see him trotted across my lawn. Clearly, I always look at the fox and he knows he's top of the food chain. He has no worries about being out in daylight in our neighborhood. But I was thinking, well, foxes kill birds. I'm probably the only unarmed man within a 50-mile radius in Western Pennsylvania. More guns in Western Pennsylvania, I think, than in Western Europe, quite probably. It's a big hunting area. Human beings kill birds too. A lot of birds around where I live. But they do it intentionally. They don't do it instinctively. And then you get weird people like me who don't kill birds and don't own guns. We choose. And so much of what we are and who we are and how much we imagine ourselves to be comes down to choices that are not hardwired into us as instincts, but are choices that we certainly experience intuitively as being free and yet defining us. And that's why I think the question of what it means to be a human has become so pressing for us today, and in many ways so problematic. And what I want to do in the first real section of this lecture is try to draw out the nature of how we imagine ourselves to be human today by drawing a contrast with how we might have done it 500, 600, 700 years ago. I come from the West Country of England. You may have noticed from my accent that I'm not from Camden, New Jersey. I grew up in the West Country of England, very rural part of the country, a very local part of the country, in that people didn't travel very far from home. Last time I was home, not last time I was home, but 4 years ago, I was home with my wife, and we were in the local pub having lunch, and the couple at the table next were chatting to the barman, and the barman said, "Are you from around here?" And they said, "Oh no, we're from Chalford." And my wife said, "Where's Chalford?" And I said, "It's about 2 miles that way." Very local. Well, in some ways, it's almost like a cultural folk memory of what it would be like to be brought up in the Middle Ages. I want to spend a few moments now reflecting on if we'd wondered about what it would be like to be a human being in the Middle Ages. What would have been the factors that would have come into play at that point? Well, the first, and it connects to the anecdote I've just given, is would be tied to a geographical place. By the way, my favorite local, all news is local story comes from my wife and I later in our lives, when I was teaching at the University of Aberdeen, lived in rural Scotland in a village where Donald Trump, after he'd left, bought a golf course. When he was elected President of the United States in 2016, the local newspaper, with the circulation probably about 500, ran the headline, "Local businessman becomes leader of the free world," which I thought was something of a classic. But if you'd grown up in the Middle Ages, life would have been very local, probably. If you'd been born, say, around about 1350, best guess, you would never have traveled more than 40 miles from where you were born. You would have been baptized, married, and buried in the same church, the same churchyard. You'd have gone to worship as and when you went to worship, past the graves of your ancestors. To be you would have been tied to a very, very distinctive geographical place. Secondly, you'd have been tied to a very particular family. My wife comes from the island of Lewis. Anybody know where the island of Lewis is? Where is it, sir? It's off the northwest coast of Scotland. She's there now visiting her mum. It's 2.5 hours off the northwest coast of Scotland. It's heading out into the Atlantic Ocean. My father-in-law's first language was not English, it was Gaelic. The sum total of the inhabitants of all of the Western Isles, I think probably about 40,000. One thing I learned very early on when I was dating my wife and then we got married was when I'm on the island, I never insult or criticize anybody because they're all part of some giant family network that connects somewhere. And no outsider has the right to insult any member of the family. Secondly, I got used to the question when I would visit the Isle of Lewis, when I'd meet people, they'd say, "Who are your people?" In other words, which family are you connected to so that we can locate you within the kind of framework and the structure of the island. That's a throwback in some ways to early modern and pre-modern society. Had you grown up in the Middle Ages, you would have grown up in a particular family and it would have been a strong source of your identity. It would have defined to a large extent who you were. You would have been set in a position within a hierarchy. We think a lot today about social mobility. I'm very privileged, and by the way, I think privilege is a good word. I think privilege is something to be grateful for, not to necessarily feel guilty about. I'm very privileged to teach at a college where I would say most of our students come from, and again, this you can see I'm English, not American. I think in class, not race categories. Most of the kids that I teach come from lower middle class or working class families, where they have been taught that working hard in education is the way to move up. It's the secret to social mobility. They live in a world, and America, of course, epitomized this perhaps more than anything else. They live in a world of social mobility. That would not be the way in the Middle Ages. You would be tied to a particular place and to a particular point in the social hierarchy. My wife is away at the moment, and she thinks that I spend my evenings reading and writing. I actually spend my evenings watching classic samurai movies that I know she would never sit through with me. What's fascinating watching classic samurai movies is the social hierarchy that plays out. A classic samurai movie like The Seven Samurai, not a cheap martial arts flick, but a classic Japanese movie, has very clearly stratified class divisions with clear expectations of the different classes, but no sense that one could move from one class to another. If you ever see in The Seven Samurai, the youngest samurai falls in love with one of the girls in the village. And this can never be, because you cannot have that kind of compromise of the class hierarchy in medieval Japan. So you've been located in a particular hierarchy. It's funny telling the students at Grove this, they're all saying, this would be terrible. This would be terrible. And I would say to them, no, because it's only frustrating if you can really imagine a real possibility of it being different. And do you own a cell phone? Yes. Can I borrow it for 12 months? Why not? Yeah, and how are you going to feel if I take your cell phone from you? You're going to feel empty. That's an interesting. I'm going to use you as an illustration in a lecture. I feel empty. You'd feel frustrated because something that you desire, something that you use, something that in some ways has become part of you, like it's become part of me, has been taken away from you. You've been reduced by that. Would it surprise you that if in 1985 one of my college professors had said to me, I'm going to take your cell phone from you, it wouldn't have bothered me in the slightest. Wouldn't have bothered me in the slightest because they didn't exist. And that desire did not exist. That possibility did not exist there. So one of the things I say to the students is, this living as part of a hierarchy would have been part of what it meant to be a human person at that particular moment in time. Next point, and I'm going to come back to this when I think about what it's like to be a person in modernity. You've probably been identified by what you made. So this is where family, calling, and identity tie in together, because so many surnames, certainly in Britain, track back to trades, things that are being made. Margaret Thatcher. One thing I know is that somewhere way back in her ancestry, the family did thatch roofs. If your name is Wheelwright, if your name is Smith, if your name is Baker, think about that. Identity is being accorded to that which individuals make. And that's going to be important when I bring this round at the end to make some sort of practical reflections. Human beings were what they made. I'm actually very indebted to Karl Marx for that. So Marx has been big on that. Human beings being what they made, and therefore industrialization became a problem because it alienated people from themselves, from that which they were making. They no longer became those who made things, they became people who earned money. And I think that is an important and significant shift. The world changed little as well. My guess, if you went back to my home village in Gloucestershire in the year 1100, hung around for a few weeks and then teleported yourself to the same village in 1200, the faces would have changed, but the names, the family names would not have done, and the rhythm and practice of life would not have changed particularly either. I moved to the United States in 2001, 3 weeks before 9/11. Fascinating experience to be a foreigner with no really legitimate papers in a nation that feels itself under attack by foreigners. Had I had an Arabic look and an Arabic surname, my experience would have been more uncomfortable, I'm sure, but it was pretty uncomfortable as it was. But I would say America has changed more in 2001 to 2022 than it probably did in the previous 20 years. And certainly more than Gloucestershire, my home county, would have changed between 1100 and say 1300 or 1350 or even 1400. Change was very, very slow. And I think that's connected to technology. How does technology play into this? Many, many ways. But I would say in the medieval world, technology by and large ran along the line set by nature. Yes, my peasant farmer ancestors, and I'm pretty sure they were peasant farmers, plowed the fields with plows. They changed the landscape somewhat. But it was done in a way that was really far more respectful, had to be respectful of nature than would be the case today. Heidegger, in his great little essay, The Question Concerning Technology, makes the point that there is a difference between building a bridge over a river, which sort of acknowledges the power of nature, and damming a river up to generate electricity. See, there are two different ways of using technology there. One which we might say sort of respects nature. The other one seeks to subdue nature and make it fit for another purpose entirely. And that brings me to my last point on the medieval person. Nature. Nature had an authority. The rhythm of the seasons would have been critical to my ancestors. The year had a rhythm to it. Time, we might say, had a rhythm and a structure that was important. My ancestors could not sow their crops in the fall and expect to harvest those crops in the winter. They had to sow their crops in the spring, wait throughout the summer, then harvest them in the fall in order to batten down the hatches for the winter that would come in. The seasons had an authority. It always strikes me, and I am a Protestant, but it always strikes me as fascinating that the Zurich Reformation, I'm giving a lecture on this in Grove on Saturday, the Zurich Reformation, which is the Reformed wing of the Reformation as opposed to the Lutheran wing, begins not with the nailing of 95 Theses on a church door in Wittenberg, a medieval university monk professor calling for a medieval debate on a medieval practice, i.e. indulgences. It begins with the printer breaking the Lenten fast by cooking sausages. Students always laugh when they think, so the Reformation began with the cooking of sausages. Yes, but look at the significance. Time is being transformed now. The old rhythm of the year no longer fits the rising technologies and the new economy. Time is changing. The workday is changing to something that can be much more regular. Time is losing its annual rhythm and becoming more of a weekly thing. Can't talk about that today, but I would say with the speed of technology today, even the weekly rhythm is disappearing. My son worked as a consultant for Deloitte for some years, and he had to give it up. The 70, 80-hour work weeks, killing him. I always get annoyed when my academic colleagues complain about their working conditions. I'm thinking, man, you should talk to my sons about some of the working conditions they've had. But my son gave up because guess what? He not only had to put in a long day, 8 to 8 in the office, he had to be on call at 3 a.m. in the morning in case his Japanese clients needed to consult with him about their investments. Time has been completely transformed for us. So, before we go back to the Middle Ages then, how does all this tie in with identity? I would say identity in the Middle Ages is very easy. Identity comes from place, family, calling, time, rhythm of time, rhythm of the seasons. And all of these things are things over which you have no power whatsoever. They're given to you. And your task is to fit in with them. You are dependent upon external authorities, and external authorities have a powerful, powerful grip over your imagination. The way you think about yourself, and of course, thereby the way you think about what it means to be a human being. Brings me then to the modern age. Okay, let's think about the modern age. First of all, I think one of the things that characterizes the modern age more than anything else is choice. And America, I think, is the land of choice more than anything else. I remember when we moved here in 2001, going to the supermarket, and Britain, 5th, 6th biggest economy in the world, it's a pretty consumerist economy. But I remember going into the average American supermarket and not being able to believe the choice of stuff that you had. and I taught students from sub-Saharan Africa. I have no idea how they handle the choice that one gets, even of painkillers that you can buy over the counter in North America. Well, that's a trivial example of choice, but think about how choice affects those other things I've talked about. Choice of place. We now choose where we live. To talk to a medieval about who are you, you would almost certainly have got an answer that located them somewhere in space. We have a little folk memory of this in Gloucestershire. It's a small county, and there's a river runs right through the middle of it. I come from the east side of the river. We don't like the folk who come from the west side of the river. They live about 10 miles away, but we don't like them. They're a bit too close to Wales. You know, they have that sort of fifth columnist feel about them. I have a very local mind, very local mind. My identity on that level sort of tied in with geography. I live 3,500 miles away from where I grew up. My identity in terms of space, there's a kind of nostalgic quality there. Yeah, I'm English. I come from Gloucestershire, but functionally, it plays no role. In fact, it plays so little role that when Americans refer to me as British, I sort of accept it. Whereas if you come from Britain, you know, that's just a construct to help foreigners understand the United Kingdom. My wife is Scottish. You refer to as British, she'll correct you and say, no, I'm Scottish. Britain is a construct. I'm Scottish. She would tell people here, we're a mixed race marriage. My husband's English and I'm Scottish. She said, I always vowed I would never marry an Englishman, and look how far I've fallen. I take the view, you know, we protected these people for centuries. As soon as they're capable of governing themselves, we'll withdraw. It's that kind of thing. So anyway, think of, that's the kind of joke that get you fired in some context, I'm sure, but I don't work here, so I'm going to go home. We have a choice of place. We choose where we live now. I bet in this room, looking around this room, there are a number of ethnicities here. I mean, America, unless you're a Native American, everybody is an immigrant somewhere in the background. And I'm guessing in this room, there are some of you are probably immigrants yourself. If not, you're second, third generation immigrants. Place no longer grips the imagination in terms of identity. Family and rank have been dramatically attenuated. Not only legally, I think the rise of no-fault divorce. My view is the rise of no-fault divorce was the moment marriage was redefined in America. I won't say gay marriage is a sideshow, but I would say gay marriage is not as culturally significant as no-fault divorce by any stretch of the imagination. And you know, given that the church pretty much didn't bother about no-fault divorce, or at least the Protestant church by and large didn't, it puts you in a very tricky situation for objecting to other forms of marriage that have emerged since. Family has been dramatically attenuated also by, I think, the attenuation of space. My oldest son got married 18 months ago, and it was during the time of COVID, so nobody from my wife's or my family's came over to the wedding. And I remember thinking, wow, it really is just us, isn't it? It's me, my wife, and our 2 sons. That's it. That's us over here. No wonder we're a tight-knit family. The number of people I can truly depend upon in life are 3, effectively, and 2 of them are my sons. You know, it's kind of like that a bit at times. You know, when your son phones and asks to speak to his mum first, you know there's going to be an ask for money involved somewhere down the line, because mum's the soft touch and they're going to get to you through her. Anyway, family, rank. I'm the first person in my family who went to college. My father left school at 16. My grandfather left school at, I think, 30. My family epitomizes the possibility for social mobility, if you like, within modern culture. Would not have happened if I'd been born 600-700 years ago. I would have been a peasant farmer. I would never have risen to the ranks of being a knight in shining armor. It would not have happened. So my rank gives me no immediate source of identity. Job fluidity. I work now, I think, at 5 different institutions in roughly the same line of work, but in 5 different places. Many of my friends have changed jobs. My son was an economic consultant, and he's a data analyst. And he's not even out of his 20s yet. job fluidity. Calling no longer gives us stability. Making has been replaced by consuming, I think, in the modern world. In the past, what would have given you status was the job you did because of the stuff you made, perhaps, or the function you fulfilled. Now, of course, what gives us status is money and our ability to consume. It's odd sometimes. I say to the students, and they can't really get their heads around it. I say, Britain is a very class-based society. I say, Paul McCartney may be one of the most highly paid men in Britain, but he'll only ever be working class. And Americans can't get their heads around that because to them, money is class. I say, no. Class in Britain is where you grew up, where you went to school. I went to a state school. It was a grammar school, but it was a state-run school. I went to the University of Cambridge, but I know there are certain jobs and there are certain clubs to which I can never belong because I didn't go to the right elite high school. Class is different, but in America, it's not so much money. And what you consume comes to define you. And then I think there's the technological imagination. What's the technological imagination do? Technology, I think, exacerbates all of these things. One of the points I'm working towards is saying, we now instinctively think of ourselves as free and autonomous. One of the things that strikes me that does that is something we perhaps don't think about because it's so trivial. Music. Think about music. 200 years ago, if you wanted to listen to music or you wanted music to be part of your life, you had to either produce it or be in the presence of somebody else who was producing it. Music was something that was produced. Now, music is something that is consumed, and by and large, consumed privately and individually. I got up early this morning. I am saying this as a virtue signal. I went to the gym, and I listened to music because running on a treadmill is utterly boring. Just pounding out the miles, it's a killer. You've got to have something to alleviate the boredom and blind you to the pain. So I listened to music, and I listened to it privately. That's an experience nobody could have had 150 years ago. Not only that, but I pick and choose what I listen to. Even when I was growing up and you had albums, vinyl LPs, it was more of an effort to eclectically listen to music then than it is now. Now I have Spotify. I can just pull the different tracks that I like to run through and put them together as my own mix. Tragically, just as an aside, sort of the death of the concept album is painful to me. That there'll never be another Pink Floyd is a cause of some mourning, I think, and should be in Western society. But think about music. What does that do? Privately consumed music, something that used to bind the community together, has become an item of individual consumption. It shapes the way we think about ourselves and our place in the world. Technology gives us an illusion of power. We tend to think that technology allows us to control things. It gives us an illusion of power, though, at the price, I think, of greater impotence than we've ever had before. And I'm not simply thinking of weapons of mass destruction here. One of my life's ambitions was to own a convertible sports car. Finally, a few years ago, I bought my wife a new car. In a moment of weakness, she said I could buy a convertible sports car. One of my sons was in the industry at the time. I pulled over into lay-by. I called him straight away and I said, fix it now before Mum changes her mind. We've probably got half an hour here to start the paperwork rolling. So I drive around in a little Mazda Miata soft top. Love it around those lanes of Pennsylvania. My dream car, though, would be a 1965 Shelby Cobra. At 750 grand, my wife won't let me sell the house and take out a loan to buy one. But what a beautiful car. It also have to be stick shifts. I can't stand. I love Elon Musk, oddly, I don't know why, but he's killing the stick shift, and that's a terrible thing as far as I'm concerned. It has to be a stick shift. But one of the great things about Shelby Cobra is it's just a stick. There's almost nothing that can go wrong with the Shelby Cobra. My Mazda, it even has this obnoxious system that tells me when to change my gears. I find that horrible. That's an art, not a science, changing gear. But in my Mazda, if something goes wrong, the whole car stops functioning. Technology comes at the price of actually making you more impotent in many ways. It also shapes my mind towards thinking of the world as stuff, or perhaps even more so. There's a problem. I'm going to talk about this more tonight in the lecture. But I think technology reshapes the way we imagine the world so that nature itself becomes far more of a problem than it ever was. Yes, cancer has always been a problem. The sex, gender of your body has not always been a problem. Technology has allowed us to imagine that it is so. So it feeds this idea of power. The result of all this, I think, various things, but I would say one of the things is this. We have come to think of ourselves as free and autonomous and as able to define our own identities. That, I think, in Europe is seen as a bleak thing. Sartre's famous statement, man is condemned to be free, which is how I start my humanities lectures at Grove. I like that statement because it's so counterintuitive to the mentality of my students. Growing up as Americans, they think freedom is an unmitigatedly good thing. Sartre, of course, is pointing out that freedom can actually be a burden. And in many ways, I think in the modern world, freedom is a burden that we can barely bear. What must it be like to be a 3-year-old and say to your parents, am I a boy or a girl? And your parents say to you, well, that's not for us to decide. Good friends of ours have just had a baby, and they've given the baby a gender-neutral name so the baby can decide for him or herself what the gender is when they get old enough to. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, oh, I know you're loving parents and wanting to care for the child as much as you can in this situation, but do you realize what a burden you're putting on the child? You're asking them to define and decide their identity at the most fundamental level. Is that a burden the individual can truly bear? So freedom and autonomy, I think, creates anxiety. It also tilts us towards thinking of other people as problems or instruments. When we see ourselves as defining ourselves, when we see ourselves as free and autonomous, how do we come to think about other people? And this is where I think it becomes significant for the family and significant for the workplace. It tilts us towards seeing other people as instruments, as means towards an end, as a means towards my self-realization, rather than as ends in themselves. And what's the issue there? How does that play out? Well, I think what it does, or what is it based on? I think what it does is it's based upon the notion that human beings, let's say, are fundamentally free and autonomous. What I want to do now really is just offer some thoughts and say, but what if that isn't true? How would that reshape how we think about ourselves in the world, how we think about ourselves in relation to our families, and how we think about ourselves in the workplace? Well, the first thing I would say about it is this. It's obviously not true. It is obviously not true, even though we all tend to believe it. If the history of humanity teaches us anything, one of the things it teaches us is this. Just because an idea is wrong and patently false does not mean that a lot of people won't believe it and attempt to build their lives and build society on the basis of it. Think of Nazi Germany. For another project I'm working on, I sat through The Triumph of the Will the other night, Lady Riefenstahl's famous film of the 1934 Nuremberg Rallies. It is a stunning piece of cinema. And it is very disturbing, though perhaps not disturbing for the reasons you might think. What most disturbed me about it was, wow, this is like every political pitch I see being made today. The anti-Semitism is disturbing. The aesthetics have been adopted wholesale, I think, by contemporary political culture. But that film gripped the German imagination. It reinforced commitment to an ideology that I would say is patently false. That Jews are not human beings. That Jews are the equivalent of a bacillus or a contagion to be wiped out. Patently false. Well, autonomy also is a false ideology as well. I was giving a lecture a couple of weeks ago. My oldest son and his she was about 3 months old at the time. My granddaughter was there, and I told my son, stand up and show the audience Emily. And he stood up and showed it to her. Partly it was me wanting to show off my granddaughter. Partly I wanted to make a point. I asked the audience, so is my granddaughter born free? To which the obvious answer was no. If my son abandons her in the woods tonight, she's dead within 36 hours. She's dead within 36 hours. Human beings are not born free. Human beings, I would suggest, contrary to what the modern world is telling us through its mobility, through its collapsing of time, through its technological revolution, through the way it provides us with music. Human beings are not autonomous. We are always defined by relationships of dependency and obligation. And we know that by instinct. We do know that instinctively. Two examples, one a thought experiment and one actually drawn from an interview. Peter Singer, the great ethicist, Princeton ethicist, radical Princeton ethicist, pro-abortion, pro-infanticide, pro-euthanasia, and unabashedly so. I'll give him credit for being consistent and honest. When his mother was ill with Alzheimer's disease, he helped care for her. I found an interview with him online where somebody asked him, the interviewer asked him, wasn't it rather inconsistent for you to care for your mother? And Singer, in an unguarded moment, gave a beautiful answer. It's truly a beautiful answer. He says, yes, I guess it's different when it's your own mother. It's a stunning insight. You bet it's different when it's your own mother, because there's a natural tie there that you may not be able to articulate. You may not be able to put it into a test tube and analyze it, but it's nonetheless real. Secondly, imagine a scenario. I don't think this has ever happened, but you can imagine Robert George, the famous pro-life professor from Princeton, walking down Witherspoon Street late one night, chatting away with Peter Singer. Perhaps an unlikely scenario, but let's say it takes place. They walk down the street and they hear a baby crying. And they look across, and there in one of the shop door fronts, there's a baby in a cradle crying. I bet the two of them do not disagree on what is to be done. I don't think Robert George is going to say, we need to call the police and get this baby somewhere safe. And Peter Singer is going to say, no, it's not really a human person. It may have life, but it's not a person. It has no concept of the future. We can just let it die. He's not going to do that. Instinctively and intuitively, the two of them are going to want to get that child safe, get them to care. So what this is to say, I think the modern philosophy of autonomy flies in the face of what it actually means to be human. There are natural instincts there. How does that play out in family and workplace? Well, I would suggest a number of things. We need to think about family and workplace in a way that reflects the fact that human beings exist in a network of natural dependencies and obligations.
Of course.
I don't think we can turn back the economic tide and say, well, all women have got to go home now and should be homemakers. I think that horse has bolted. But I do think it behoves businessmen and business owners to think about how their business might operate in a way that helps and assists those employees who have families to properly fulfill those obligations to those to whom they are obliged, those who are naturally dependent upon them. Maybe it needs a rethinking of the workplace, from seeing it as a place where we are earning money to a place where we're actually helping people to be truly human. Clearly, businesses have to make money. I'm not that naive. I may work, I may produce nothing of any use, but I understand that you've got to produce stuff that you've got to be able to sell. You've got to be able to make money.
But if you have a philosophy that sees that as part of a strategy that allows people to be truly human, to take pride in their work, for example, to take pride in the things that they make, the deals that they broker, and allows them to fulfill their commitments and obligations to others. Surely that is a more human kind of thing. The family, I think we could get into all kinds of discussions here. It seems to me that we are at a point in our society where there is a dangerous tilting towards seeing children either as problematic or as seeing them as consumer goods or as commodities. Various reasons for that. I might touch upon that this evening, though some of the reasons for that are likely to be very controversial and highly contested. But a reimagining of the family that sees the family actually as a network of natural obligations, where the whole idea that one might say, you know, do I have to sacrifice my career for my children or my children for my career? Is it possible to reach a position where that becomes a nonsensical statement? So all of this is to say then, I think what we're witnessing at the moment is a dramatic transformation of what it means to be a human being compared to that which it has been historically. And in a way that I think actually defies some of the instincts that are actually hardwired into us and make us human. I want to end there to give some time for questions or discussion. If you don't mind, I'll go and grab my bottle of water as well. I'm conscious of going a little hoarse at this point. Any questions? Yes, sir. As you knew the Isle of Lewis, I will give you first dibs. You recognized it in the voice.
Partly that. One of my best friends is from Gloucestershire.
Interesting.
But the attitudes as well. But actually, my question is actually somewhat different, and a great lecture, really. Very insightful. I've been reading quite a bit of radical gender theorists recently. I think what's going on. I expected, because you really expect too, perhaps, that this idea of individual choice and autonomy would play a large role in their thinking. It's not there at all. Completely absent. They talk always about communities, right? The trans community, the non-binary community, the lesbian community, and so on. And they don't discuss, it's any time we get to discuss how these communities form and how people get in them. But it doesn't seem to be by choice or by individual autonomy, right? I guess it's something like, at some age, you just find yourself belonging to this community, the relationships are meaningful to you, and so on. So I'm just wondering, you know, are these theorists just misunderstanding the phenomenon that really the root it is individual choice? Or is this a reaction to the radical individualism you're describing, or what?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. A couple of comments. One, I think, while a lot of people point to Marx and Marxist traditions lying behind a lot of the sort of critical theory, I think Hegel is a key philosopher. I think of Judith Butler, for example. Some of her early work is Hegel, particularly the influence of Hegel on French thinkers. And the issue of recognition of belonging rather than of individual autonomy is huge there. Secondly, I think the impact of Foucault and a certain reading of Nietzsche, where you're left wondering, is there such a thing as the self? It's very, you know, you could find it sort of vertiginous reading these theorists. Just as a aside, one of the things I've tried to say to students is when you read these people, you'll find them terribly confusing. But don't worry, because I think that's actually part of what they're doing. It's not simply what they're saying, it's the way they're saying it. It's part of what they're trying to say. And that destabilizing and decentering of the self in which they indulge is fascinating, but also vertiginous and terrifying, because you come away thinking, is there any self? Is there any agency? My response to that would be, well, first of all, would be to acknowledge the power of that argument, but then secondly, to say, there has to be some, because we intuitively experience the world as free. And I don't think that's an illusion. They might say, oh, it isn't, that's just the illusion of the regimes of truth or the discourses of power within which you're trapped. Well, I would say maybe But we know that discourses of power can be resisted. We know that heretics can emerge. And intuitively, I feel I operate in this world as somebody who makes choices. So I tilt towards thinking there is such a thing as the self, and there is such a thing as autonomy. But I think you're absolutely correct in seeing that, particularly the radical postmodern people, yeah, they might well turn around and say autonomy is not what we are into. And you see that a little bit, I suppose, in critical race theory is a hot button issue, but it's kind of hard to. My read on critical race theory is that individuals are just not responsible for it at the end. The system and the categories are responsible, but individuals are not, which again ties into the same thing. And as a Christian, I want to come back and say, the problem with that is it ultimately denies the possibility of grace and forgiveness. If there can be no repentance, there can be no forgiveness. So I find it a rather bleak and hopeless thing. I also see, though, when you said to take it in a slightly different direction, when you talk about the power of the community, I think that is something we need to take on board. And again, as a Christian, one of the things I've been saying in churches over the last year or two is, don't spend all your time whining and lamenting about what's going on. If you're going to be marginalized, that's worse things can happen than being marginalized. And the interesting thing about being on the margins is we typically find that groups on the margins become strong communities and generate strong identities. My real profession is a Reformation historian. I've never been fully persuaded by Weber's Protestant ethic, the spirit of capitalism thesis, because in England in the 19th century, yes, the captains of industry were Protestants, but they weren't just Protestants. They were non-conformist Protestants who couldn't be part of the establishment. They couldn't be members of parliament, they couldn't go to university, they couldn't teach at university, they couldn't be civil servants. What could they do? They could make stuff. And so they did. And I think marginality is a key thing there. So I think that the insights that queer theory has on community could be very helpful to people who are not queer theorists, but are interested in, well, how do we produce strong communities with what's going on? Yes, sir.
I love your vision on what workplace could be. And are you envisioning not just a new way that workplaces are oriented, or would it also require new laws to happen as well? A little insight into the question. I have a business. It used to be what I primarily made money on. Now I primarily make money elsewhere, but keep the business. I want to treat my employees better, but I find myself stymied by, well, am I giving favoritism to this one because they have a family and this one who doesn't have a family? And how do you?
Yeah,
I didn't realize I may be out
Yeah.
in the legal area, but
I'm not really a libertarian, nor am I a lawyer, but my instincts are that when things get imposed by law, they can often generate more problems than they solve, particularly sort of regulation of the workplace. Not to say that there aren't certain regulations that are good. My grandfather was a trade union man, spent all his life campaigning for better working conditions for working men, and I think did a lot of good. But point taken, what I would like to see is a culture where the intuitions of the culture are such that this kind of thing is normative. I think once you start, laws tend to beget laws, and that can become burdensome and problematic. I'll go forward and then back.
I want to ask if you were able to elaborate a little bit on your statement that you think the ship has sailed on, I think you said, making women go back into the home.
I wouldn't make them go back into the home, but it being a practical possibility for many, I guess.
And the idea that ship has sailed, actually, like, when you say that, to just accept that grieves me deeply. Because I think it's one thing to say women can have other professions, and that's great. But to say that, to create a structure in which everybody is, the economic structure, so as we are obligated to have 2-income homes, seems to me that, as in all things, women and children pay the price of things that are disordered. Because, you know, so I'm just curious if you can unpack why you're saying we have to just accept that. That made me just sad. Yeah, maybe I'll just.
Well, I think as individuals, we don't have to accept it, and every family can make its own choice on that front. I think the overall tilt of the modern social imaginary in the West tilts towards a certain level of affluence, and that practically requires more than one income if you don't have a spectacular single income.
Especially when there's more dual incomes, and then that drives the price up
Yeah.
things for those.
I mean, when I think when my wife and I took out our first mortgage, the multiple in the UK you could get was 2.5 times your salary. Now I think it's 7 times your salary or something. The absurd things seem to have happened economically over the last 20, 30. I'm no economist. My son is, and he tells me, yeah, a lot of it's absurd. I just think as a practical option for many, it's not the case. And it's not always the case either that it's because people, often it's because people want a certain level of affluence. But when I was a pastor, I'm thinking there were people in my church, they were poor. They needed 2 low-grade job incomes just to make it. I get a bit annoyed sometimes when conservative Christians seem to think that it's just affluent, greedy people who both go out to work. No, sometimes it can be the poor, because it's the only way they're able to pay the heating bills and put food on the table. I think that needs to be taken into account as well. But it just seems to me that we have shifted so far in the direction of 2-income families. As a layman, it looks very hard to get back. It may be sad, but I think, like on so many things in our culture at the moment, we're not going to see any national transformation anytime soon. It can be done at the level of individual choice, but I'm not sure that our culture can be turned around overnight on that, as on many other issues.
So you say it just is descriptive with no prescriptive.
Yeah, but I wasn't saying it because I wasn't saying it because I approve or disapprove of it. I was just sort of, I think it's the way it is.
Thanks for the talk. A lot of really interesting points. Kind of coming from more of a technology and property theory kind of perspective. And my question is about, as you're talking about this, speaking about data and algorithms and what we call abundance versus scarcity, and looking at sort of transition over time. I'm wondering if you have a perspective on that. For example, I think the Salem Center is involved in a lot of data-driven research. There's a lot of abundance of data, apps and technology and all sorts of things that can give a lot of insights. Do you have a perspective on how abundance is changing some of the, it relates to some of your viewpoints of it's changing society?
I've not really reflected on that. I mean, and I'm not you can tell from the way I do my lecture, I'm not a huge computer guy. I'm a fountain pen and a notebook guy, by and large. I have not reflected on that. I suppose the closest thing that came to, I read Yuval Noah Harari's Homo Deus, where he has a section on that kind of stuff. And I don't like the idea of using the algorithmic model to understand what it means to be a human. Would be as far as I've got, but I'm not sure that I could comment any further on that. I fear that it's probably what my son as a data analyst does with most of his waking hours, but I don't inquire too deeply. So sorry about that.
I may have another question. I want to
sure.
The time. Is there, from a religious perspective, is there a common theme you may see across the monotheistic faiths? Christian, Jewish, Muslim faith, are there differences, or do you think the concepts that religion may be uniform across faith?
It's interesting you asked that, because when I wrote my book, I was very clear that, hey, this is a European/North American narrative, even perhaps more European than American. I do not expect that it will cross over into other cultures. Well, it was picked up by some good Jewish friends of mine pretty quickly. That didn't surprise me so much. You know, the Jewish communities are pretty well integrated into the United States of America. they face similar issues. What's happened in the last 6 months is I've started to get correspondence from young Muslims who've been reading this stuff. And is there a common theme? The common theme that I've been able to discern is the issue of external authority. What we're seeing is a reconfiguration in the West and beyond, because it's clear from some of my Islamic correspondence that this is taking place in non-Western cultures as well, because of the proliferation of the internet, etc., that the issue is traditional forms of external authority are being challenged and replaced by new forms of authority. And I think that's where, I mean, I was really surprised when this professor of Islamic studies wrote to me and said, hey, wow, I've been teaching your book at my mosque and it's been really helpful. So, wow, that came out of the blue. I didn't expect that. And he essentially said it's because our young people face the same issues. They're expressive individualists too. That crashes up against a lot of Islamic teaching. So I was both surprised and somewhat, I wouldn't say gratified, because that makes me sound like I'm gratified that their community is struggling with the same rubbish that we're struggling with. But I was gratified in a professional sense that, wow, the work is not just the work of a middle-class white guy connecting with other middle-class white guys. It's crossing into other communities. And that, well, yeah, because the cultural phenomena that we're seeing in the West today are not restricted to the West. And while they may, the specifics of the challenge may be different for a Muslim than they are for a Christian or a Jewish person, they probably break along similar lines of tradition, external authority versus modernity, stability versus flux, those kind of things. I was glad I was able to answer one of your questions more thoroughly than the other. So, you want to ask a question?
Yeah. In the discussion of women working outside of the home versus spending their majority of their time doing their domestic responsibilities, to what degree has that has most women staying home and not working outside the home, to what degree has that really been a viable social model throughout most of history, especially if you think of a large, like a family farm as a small firm as well? And in addition to that, is our perspective in the U.S. warped on that a little bit just because we happen to find one unique moment in history when it was kind of viable, when 3/4 of the world's productive capacity had been destroyed by war?
Yeah, I think good question. As to the first, I think the notion of the family has changed over time. I think of my wife's family, which in some ways it's an early modern family structure, or even maybe at times a pre-modern family structure, that as a young girl, she would have to go with the family to cut peats from the peat bank to get fuel in for the winter. And not everybody did it. And the older folk were there and they looked after the babies while the able-bodied young people and adults cut the peat. Same applied with cutting the hay and getting the hay in. And I think we're very fixated in some circles on the role of women inside or outside the home, whereas a better way of thinking, I think, is what about the family as a set of mutual obligations and dependencies? I love the work. She's a friend, so I'm not unbiased on this. I love Erica Bakioki's work, her book, The Rights of Women, that I actually give extra credit to students who read and do a review on that. Erica is she describes herself as a pro-life feminist, but in her book, The Rights of Women, she makes, I think, a good case for the problem today is not that women that women want to be men. The problem is that men have forgotten their family responsibilities, and that actually we need to think holistically about when the woman's pregnant, both man and the woman have huge responsibilities. When the baby's born, man and woman have huge responsibilities. And I think that touches on what you're saying. Obviously, technology, modernity I mean, Marx and Engels point this out in the Communist Manifesto. The more industry is automated, the easier it'll be for women to work outside the home, because the raw strength needed for work, which typically favors men, will no longer be an issue. A woman presses a button on a computer with the same skill as a man presses a button on a computer. So technology has changed the way we imagine this to be. Can't remember your second question.
My second question was really just more of an observation, which is I think in the US, we have a somewhat distorted perspective on this, because in the 1950s, we managed to find a unique moment in history when it was kind of sort of viable, because 3/4 of the world's productive capacity has been destroyed by war.
Right. Quite possible. Quite possible.
Yeah, you know, I think that the economic arrangements in the U.S. in the 1950s are much more of a historical outlier,
Right,
because of we were coming out of the war, than is commonly understood in most scholarship.
Yeah. And I think you were there pointing as well to a general problem that affects a lot of the issues of identity, and that's we tend to operate either with a radical nominalism or a hard essentialism. Whereas when we're talking about family, roles of men and women, etc., it's somewhere between the two. That there are natural factors involved here, but there are also socially constructed factors that are very significant as well.
Okay, can I make one quick follow-up comment just to maybe clarify what I said earlier? Was I think Marx is right that part of what's playing into questions about women in work is that move from maker to consumer, and the way that the Industrial Revolution isolated the home from the workplace, and that prior to the Industrial Revolution, families worked together in much more organically integrated ways, where the children were present, mom was able to, we were makers together. And then the Industrial Revolution created this alienation, and for a while we could afford that alienation to work. I think what I just don't want to give into is this idea that the answer is, you know, I think it's part of that maker consumer alienation that women need to go just make money now. Right. And the way that alienates them from, you know, more biologically connected roles at home, and that to just give into that will only further fragment the family and prevent its ability to be a sustainable source of identity and meaning in culture.
Yeah, just where you were saying that, my mum lives in an old Cotswold cottage on the side of a hill, and in the living room there's a great sandstone fireplace with holes in it where the weaver's loom would have been. And of course the family, it was one room down below and one room above. They would all have slept in the same room, and they would all have worked and played in the same room, which would be a very, very different experience of production to that which we experience today.
And ironically, a benefit to the internet is, for all its downsides, it has helped bring some work back into the home. Yeah,
and maybe that's a benefit. If my son works for Capital One, they were told they're all going to be back in the office last week. He was the only one who turned up. And his bosses said, "Oh, this isn't worth it. We're just going to work from home, come in one day a week, and that'll suffice." So there's a lot more working from home going on now as well. I hate to grant the internet any credibility at all, but perhaps I've got to acknowledge it there. Any further questions?
Bringing in also the notion of leisure, you know, in the thinking of Joseph Pieper, and I've read some things recently by R.J. Snell on this, and you know, where the family comes in this. In fact, he has a very good article called "Work, Family, and the Restoration of Culture," and how that fits in the work and the freedom, autonomy, and the nature of the family as a focus of meaning.
Yeah, Paul Kingsnorth has written similar things on home as a way of resisting what's going on at the moment. Part of the problem, of course, though, is that the work is now starting to colonize private space and private time. I mean, you know, I check my email at weekends, and hey, if a student emails me at 8 o'clock on a Saturday evening, in tears because of something, I'm not going to wait till Monday to reply. I'm going to reply there and then, but that intrudes on family time. Even yesterday, I was sitting in the airport. Where do I sit? I sit near a plug so I can charge my phone. You know, technology is really changing even that leisure time, the shape and nature of leisure time. Yep.
I'm not sure this is a developed question. When I'm talking about communities and this gender identity business, that is a language that they traffic in extensively. At the same time, it's hard to imagine that it's described as something that people have no choice but to join or recognize. And then the segue to this, like you talk about marginality as being, in some ways, I forget what you're talking about. I think of this freeing potential and source of identity. And yet we think about there are different marginalized communities, and part of it is your power to maintain marginalization status. Right? Because clearly, homemakers are kind of a marginalized status these days. They're a decent sized group, not massive, but you know, compared to say the trans community, people do not think of homemakers as somehow marginalized, right? Or considered academics. We do think of ourselves as marginalized. There's some creativity in all of these, but there's a ton of power about who can capitalize on their marginalized community and can't. I don't know if there's a question on that.
Yeah, I think I had some conversations with a woman called Rosaria Butterfield, she was professor of queer theory at Syracuse and is now the wife of a Reformed Presbyterian pastor and a homeschooling mom of 3 adopted kids from Africa. And I asked her, you know, what is it that, what's the key to marginalization? And her view was opposition to white heterosexual heteronormativity. That's the key to being able to claim to be marginalized at this point. So it doesn't matter how practically marginalized you are, politically, you're not able to command the rhetoric or the aesthetics of marginalization unless you fall into that category.
And you have to be able to cooperate with white heterosexuals to make that stick.
Yeah.
Because there still are a lot of them.
Yeah. Which is the point that Camille Paglia makes brilliantly. If you've never read Camille Paglia's article, The Joy of Presbyterian Sex, it's the most devastating critique of the 1991 PCUSA, Presbyterian Church of the United States of America report on sexuality. And one of the points that she makes about that report is it's so clean and respectable that it's embracing all of the sexual minority groups that middle-class cocktail party America think are respectable. And at some point, she says she demands to know, you know, where are the foot fetishists in all of this? And she starts to list these other crazy groups, and she says, you know, why aren't they there? And then she has this. She ends the paragraph with a very laconic statement: no lobby groups, I guess. Full stop. And I think it gets to the heart of it that some groups are able to organize and capitalize on pathologies of modern culture, and other groups don't enjoy that privilege.
Yeah. If I had, you know, $1 million or 10 million, 90% of it I would spend on public relations.
Yeah. Hey, I'm an immigrant, but nobody thinks about me when they talk about immigrants, because I'm a white guy with a degree and I've done rather well since I came here. So I don't count, even though I don't have a vote. And I have gone through American passport control when I've had the guy throw the passport on the floor and tell me, get on your hands and knees and pick it up. And I've had to do it. So I had some indignities thrown my way, but they don't amount to a hill of beans because I don't look right.
Last question?
I have one.
Could you elaborate more on what you said in the discussion that cancer is always
Yeah. Yeah, I think that here it comes down to an assumption. Do you assume that human nature has a shape and has a certain authority? And I think for many hundreds and hundreds of years, the medical profession assumed that. So that somebody who has cancer, the body's malfunctioning, and therefore physically must be put right. And that to develop a cancer treatment is not to fundamentally challenge the nature of what it means to be a human being. It's to try to put back on track that which has somehow become derailed. I think we're at a stage now where medicine no longer thinks that way, and that the body is not simply something that is to be kept on track, but it's something that is to be enhanced if possible. To take perhaps a less contentious example than the transgender question, and I'm going to talk, this is anybody going to be there tonight, you're going to hear me say this again, but think about plastic surgery. Plastic surgery was developed after the First World War to help soldiers who've been terribly disfigured by mustard gas attacks, shell attacks in the trenches. And it's developed as a way of trying to put back together that which has been torn apart or damaged. That's not how we think about plastic surgery. Plastic surgery is, man, if I think my nose is a bit off, I can pay to have it adapted. My body becomes something that I can transcend in some way. And that goes down to what extent are we willing to accept what nature throws at us, and how do we judge what nature throws at us? Does that answer the question?
And if I'm not understanding, transgenderism existed before modern medicine.
Oh, sure, but it's always been understood as a psychiatric disorder. So if you were to go to a doctor 150 years ago and say, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body, the doctor, and here I'm not making a judgment on the medical diagnosis, I'm just sort of describing, the doctor would say, that's a problem. It's a problem of your mind. We need to treat your mind and bring it into conformity with your body. If you go to the doctor today with that, the doctor's going to say, put simplicity, the doctor's probably going to say, that's a problem with the body. We need to bring it into line with the mind. What's the difference? Well, you could argue a queer theory, you could argue theoretical stuff. But I would say at an even deeper level, the difference is technological. 150 years ago, the doctor could not have imagined giving any other diagnosis. Whereas now, technology places in our hand this power that allows us to think that this is a problem of the body, not of the mind. Now, whether it is a problem of the body or of the mind, that's a different question. But my view on this is, from a social imagination point of view, technology has made that possible in a way that analogous to being born in Gloucestershire in 1200 and somebody saying, you might rise to be Prime Minister in London. Would have been unthinkable then. Now it's quite possible for a child in Gloucestershire to be born and think of that as a potential live God. So that was what I was trying to get at, how technology has really shaped how we think about nature. Nature's, the authority of physical nature, we might say, has decreased as our technological powers have increased. Transhumanists think that's a good thing. Others think that's not such a good thing.
As another example, on the women's issues again, the technology tells me I can put my career first, delay fertility till 40, 45, and then use the technology, reproductive technology, in order to still have a career and a family. But as O'Donovan, the scholar O'Donovan, I can't remember his
Oliver
first name,
O'Donovan.
Oliver. Yeah, he says that's not so much restoring fertility, restoring the fertility of my body, let's say, as circumnavigating it and industrializing reproduction.
Because nature there, it's better that young people have children because they have the energy and the strength to bring kids up. A woman who's 60 who conceives, it's going to be problematic or more problematic. So
I need the technology that I've had to babysit my kid.
Yeah. Talking about that, I was shocked in the airport the other week. There was a baby crying, and to pacify the baby, the guy held up his iPhone in front of the baby. And the baby stopped crying, and I said to him, wow, that's the new pacifier, the screen. And yeah, my wife wouldn't even allow our kids to have, we call them dummies in the UK, those rubber things you shove in the mouths.
There's an article that came out that's actually being sought to increase vision problems, because kids aren't outside looking at distances and allowing their distance to that develop in their eye, but when
Wouldn't
they're always
surprise
looking at screens, that's part of why there's this increase in eyesight problems that can't be explained by genetics.
Yeah.
It's super interesting.
Yes.
Thanks, Carl.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for